do you say when someone asks you, Shona, Ian, but where is God? What would you say? Where is God? Well, in the first century in Judaism, the classic answer was God is found in the temple and in the law. The religious leaders' responsibilities were to be guardians of these two great gifts. But then there came a rabbi from up north around Galilee who appeared to be undermining both. This morning we continue the story of Stephen. Last week we met him as one of those leaders who'd been chosen and affirmed by the apostles to help with the food bank so that all in the community could benefit. Now as we go on with the story, in verse 8 of chapter 6, we read this wonderful and concise statement. Stephen, full of grace and power, did great wonders and signs among the people. In this role of distributing food, Stephen encountered people, and by his words and actions, he shared Jesus with them. Jesus who was not bound to a building, not set in the past, but alive and active. Now this was all confusing for religious folks because had he, this Jesus, not been crucified? And yet Stephen is speaking of him in the present, and he is acting in his name. As guardians of the faith, the religious leaders felt that they had to intervene. They couldn't accept that God could be found outside the temple and the law. They were anxious to keep the law, and their role was to help others from going astray. And so we have this confrontation. This comes to a head. Stephen is brought before the court for a proper explanation. In his day it was more than audacious to claim that God could be found outside the temple building and the law. It was heretical and blasphemous. Instead, however, of going on the defensive, it would appear in his speech that Stephen goes on the attack. Look back into your past, and you'll see that God has spoken through the patriarchs, through Moses, the monarchy, and the prophets. And which one of them did you not reject, he asks. You have a wrong understanding of the temple and of the word. God's presence is not limited. Look at your history. God spoke and met with his people in a foreign land. In Egypt, God is there. He spoke to Moses in Egypt. He spoke and met his people in the wilderness. God had met with them in surprising and unusual places. Through this presentation of history, Stephen is effectively saying, look, I'm not guilty. Rather, it's you who are guilty of limiting where God can be found. It's one of the longest sermons we have in the New Testament, and ironically, it is unfinished. For Stephen doesn't yet get to the place of Jesus before his hearers have had enough and they pick up stones. Where is God? What answer would you give? At this time of COVID-19, we have been without church buildings. We have enjoyed times together in them in the past, but they cannot constrain God or exhaust God's revelation to us of his love. This reminds me of an old story of a wee boy who heard it said that God was with them. Is God with us in our town? Yes, his mother said. Is God with us in our street? Yes, of course. Is God then in this house with us? Yes, he is. Is God in this room with us right now? Yes. Is God at the table with us? Yes. Is God in my cup? Yes. The boy slaps a plate over the top of his cup. Well, I've got him. As we lift our eyes beyond our buildings and the past, so we look for God speaking to us in our gardens, on our walks, in ways that aren't constrained, that aren't limited. Guided walks are becoming an increasingly popular way of offering folks an encounter with God. And I'm excited by all the life and colour and beauty of God at work in the world around us. And this is why I'm hoping that soon we might start some sort of forest church. And then if faith is found in walking, so too it's found in serving and journeying with people in other places and buildings around Pennycook, in schools, in new housing. Do we see God at work now today? Or do we prefer to look back and wish to fearfully hold on to something about replicating yesterday? We've talked in previous weeks about following in the ways of Jesus, as well as knowing the words of Jesus. For this is walking by faith. Stepping forward and planning for the future will take effort, as together we discern where God is speaking and how and what this means for the local church. It will also take courage. Stephen becomes the first Christian martyr. He is defiant in saying that God speaks today. He could not preach a Jesus who was dead, but a Jesus who is alive. This way of church is not without cost. Finally, as we read the story of the stoning of Stephen, we see also a new chapter beginning. For this terrible event marks a turning point in the history of Christianity. We read in Acts chapter 2 that Christians met in the temple. Well, it appeared the most obvious and the best place for them to meet with God. Probably if they'd stayed there, then this group could have remained a small sect of Judaism. Now, after what has happened to Stephen, they are thrown out of the temple. It was Stephen's death that launches a persecution against Jesus' followers. That begins in the very next chapter, chapter 8. 8 verse 1. On that day, a severe persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout the countryside of Judea and Samaria. The message now was not come to our building, the temple in Jerusalem, and find God, but rather come to Jesus and find life, healing, and be part of a dynamic movement of justice and joy. It was no longer come to us to meet with God. Now the disciples go and take the gospel to other places where people are. So may God grant us the courage to serve and to be ready to give a reason for the hope within us. May God grant us the focus to discern God's leading through our meetings, readings, and listening. May God grant us courage to speak out the gospel wherever we are, and may the Spirit of Jesus be at work in us and around us as we walk in his way.